So this scenario is something very interesting that could affect the Doctor Who universe massively if you look at it at a different scale. So today's video is going to analyse the what if scenario of what if the Doctor never abandoned Captain Jack on the game station. Okay, this is going to be a long video. Let's begin. This scenario takes place on the game station following the death of the Dalek Empire at the hands of Rose Tyler. The Doctor would find Jack alive and well, and the Doctor would most likely explain that Rose brought Jack back to life. This would also mean that Jack is also present for the Doctor's regeneration inside the TARDIS, and in turn would also mean Jack is present for the events of the Christmas special. And this is another quick note. The events of the first season of Torchwood will most likely not take place. My theory is that if the Doctor hadn't abandoned Jack on the game station, Jack would remain with the Doctor and Rose for the entirety of season 2, but would eventually leave to set up the new Torchwood following the Battle of Canary Wharf. This would mean that Jack's new Torchwood team would consist of the original lineup, except Gwen Cooper wouldn't have joined. It is certainly the events of season 3 opening would possibly draw the attention of Torchwood, meaning that this is where Jack crosses paths with the Doctor and where Jack first meets Martha. Now, I can see a few stories in which Jack would possibly be present for. Jack, I would say, most likely be present for the Daleks invading New York, because, well, I mean, he has met the Daleks before, so why not let Jack meet them again? And Jack could also be present for the New York incident in Gridlock, and this would mean Jack potentially gets to meet himself, and this probably would have been a scenario in which they could have confirmed that yes, Jack is in fact the face of Bo. Perhaps the face of Bo could have obviously recognised his younger self. And while I'd like to say Jack could have been present for the Lazarus experiment episode, it's most likely he would be off doing Torchwood work at this time. The Doctor and Jack, in my opinion, would then eventually cross paths again in episode 11. The events of Utopia would most likely take place because, as the Doctor said, you're a fixed point in time and space, you're a fact. So the events of the 11th episode would have most likely taken place as normal, except the Doctor and Jack wouldn't have the conversation about Jack's immortality. Also, Jack would already know about Rose being trapped in the parallel world. Also, the two-parter, i.e. Sound of the Drums / Last of the Time Lords, aka the best finale in Doctor Who history, would have still gone ahead as normal. I think nothing would have changed. Jack, however, would possibly stick by the Doctor, and Martha would still leave at the end of the series to take care of her family. The Doctor and Jack would take on the Heavenly Host during the events of Voyage of the Damned, and it's highly likely that Astrid may never have died, assuming that the Doctor and Jack find a new way to take down Max Capricorn without Astrid's sacrifice. However, I couldn't find a way around this, so Astrid would still sacrifice herself, and Jack would leave the Doctor to return to Torchwood. Quick side note, when Jack was on adventures with the Doctor, he leaves Torchwood in the capable hands of Yanto Jones, his friend, if you will. The events of Series 4 would most likely remain unchanged up until the Stolen Earth. Now, this is due to a very important factor. For one thing, Jack was with the Doctor during most of Season 2, and most importantly, during the Christmas invasion. He would never find the Doctor's severed hand, and therefore Jack making the Doctor detector would never have existed, meaning the debut of the 11th Doctor would have been in the Stolen Earth. The Doctor and his companions would most likely find a way to defeat the Daleks without the Meta-Crisis. Without the Doctor's hand, Donna Noble can't create a biological Meta-Crisis. And because, well, they kind of have to find another way because reality bomb, end of the universe, go boom, everyone dies. While you may think that Rose, who eventually gets back to the main Earth, the main Doctor Who continuity, the Doctor is not the man Rose once knew, so she decides to leave the Doctor for good, and along with Jack, Martha and Mickey, she, along with the latter two, join Torchwood where they will work together. So it's most likely that Torchwood would have been very skilled in terms of alien invasions. The Doctor and Donna would continue travelling together, and eventually, this is the most important part, the 11th Doctor would cross paths with the Master. Another quick side note here, it is complete and utter blasphemy that the 11th Doctor never met the Master. That is probably one of the biggest missed opportunities in Doctor Who, at least in the Stephen Moffat era. So, in the end of time, after Rattle and the Master have gone back to the Time War, I'm not sure the Doctor would actually sacrifice himself. I'm going to do a bit of explaining here. In the end of time, the only reason the Doctor sacrificed his own life was to save Wilf, and that was only because he knew he was going to die, and then there was the whole he will knock 4 times. However, this is where things take a drastic turn. The Doctor would be very torn up and make the vow to never travel with anyone again, because instead of the Doctor sacrificing himself, Donna would sacrifice herself to save her grandfather. the Doctor would be very torn up and makes the vow, "I will never travel with anyone again." Another quick side note. Sadly, this is the last quick side note. The Doctor deeming himself the Time Lord victorious wouldn't occur, and this would mean that he has to leave the crew of Bowie Base 1 to die, therefore keeping the timeline intact. I believe this would happen because the 10th Doctor was so battle-scarred from losing all of his other friends that he said, "Screw it, the laws of time are mine. I'm the last of the Time Lords, they will obey me." And he became the Time Lord victorious in that episode. However, with this being a new Doctor, I think that it would be a very difficult decision for him. It's either he changes a fixed point in time, or he has to keep the timeline intact, because fixed points in time are probably irreversible, and it's highly likely that the Bowie Base 1 crew would have died at any other point. So the Doctor makes the very difficult choice of leaving the crew to die. So moving on to the events of Season 5, this would also mean that the Doctor never meets Amy, Rory, or even River Song, which effectively, if you think about it, erases River from the timeline. And it's most likely that Doctor Who would have ended with Series 5, because there's no companions, no Wharton Rory, no Amy Pond. But if you think about it, if River's erased from the timeline, then there's no Pandorica for the Doctor to be imprisoned in. So the Doctor would have continued travelling, and most likely would have met Clara at a different earlier point, perhaps even in the Christmas special, and the stories would have been almost entirely different. And I'm going to add some of my own notes here. Number 1, would the Doctor have still crossed paths with Sarah Jane in Death of the Doctor? Yes, because the Doctor, well, he would have been travelling alone at this point in the timeline, if the Doctor had actually not abandoned Jack in this timeline. And the Doctor would have still crossed paths with Sarah Jane, Joe Grant, and all the others in that show. Another thing, not really up to date with the Sarah Jane adventures, don't really have much knowledge on that show. And this is the second part that I find interesting. Would the Doctor have crossed paths with Jack and Torchwood? Given that the Doctor had regenerated, and I think it's fairly possible that the Doctor could have crossed paths with Jack at some point. How? We'll never know. And presumably, the events of the 50th anniversary would have remained unchanged, except maybe it's highly likely that one of the 10th Doctor's companions could have appeared as well. Whether it's Donna, whether it's Martha, whether it's Jack, we'll never know. But those are my thoughts on what would happen if Jack wasn't abandoned on the game station by the Doctor, and I have to say, these events are very, very interesting to think about. The Doctor not abandoning Jack on the game station leads to an earlier appearance of the 11th Doctor, and that is very cool to think about. So what do you guys think of this what if scenario? If you think it's fairly interesting, then let me know in the comments. If you want to see more videos, subscribe and stick around for more. Thanks for watching.